Center. You can find the schedule of those programs on our website at www.booktv.org. Click on Business of Books. You'll also find audio and video previews, as well as the program you just saw. "48 hours of nonfiction books on TV. You're watching Book TV on C-SPAN 2. Coming up, historian Howard Zinn. He's the author of several books, including A People's History of the United States. Then Cincinnati, Ohio journalist Laura Pulfer discusses her new book, I Beg to Differ. It's a collection of her newspaper columns and radio commentaries. She's followed by sociologist Sarah Diamond, who's published her fourth book examining the accomplishments and influence of conservative Christian organizations.
Was there a favorite book that you read in 1998?
Yes, actually there was. It was Killer Angels.
What's it about?
The Battle of Gettysburg. And ironically, I'd never been to Gettysburg, although I live a couple hours away, so I read it. We went up, and I stood in the spot where some of those people were, Chamberlain. It really added a level of interest. I've read it since. I read it twice, in fact. I liked it so much.
Now, that's a novel about the Civil War that was written about 20 years ago, and the author's son has written a couple more books about the same characters.
Right.
Have you read those?
No, I've purchased them, and they're still in my stack of books. In fact, his father has died, and he has sort of carried on, and he's been making the rounds, signing books, so we're going to try to read those soon, I hope.
One of my favorite books was A Civil Action, and it's a book about companies that potentially polluted some groundwater and some children who may have gotten sick from that. It was a particular interest to me because I'm an environmental attorney, and I read that book, and I worked on both sides of the issues, going after polluters and also representing the interests of polluters. And it's kind of very interesting because there's no clear-cut answer, and I thought the book did a tremendous job of looking at all the issues and really how difficult it is to really prove something like, whether people actually hurt from some of these toxic releases. So I recommend the book, and I think it was a great experience.
So what were some of your favorite books of 1998?
I liked, some of mine were Chicken Soup for the Teenage Soul. I liked it because all the stories, they were written by like kids my age or older.
I liked The Witches because it's like a book that it's like not true, and like you can really get into it, and it's really exciting, and like you don't know what's going to happen next, and it's different.
Do you read more novels then, fiction than nonfiction?
Yeah.
Another one I liked was Island of the Blue Dolphins because you really had to use your imagination and imagery to imagine like the island and stuff she was really doing.
I read a Harriet Tubman book in school, and I like to learn about history. Just one of the things I really like to learn about.
Another one was Johnny Tremaine, and I read that in school, and it was, I think I like it because I like reading about the Revolutionary Wars in history, like historical fiction.
I read James and the Giant Peach. It's another fantasy book. It's by the same author as The Witches, Roald Dahl. He's one of my favorite authors.
So you guys read a lot of books. Which reads more?
Coming up on Book TV, author Daniel Horowitz on his book, Betty Friedan and the Making of the Feminine Mystique, The American Left, the Cold War, and Modern Feminism. Mr. Horowitz spoke at Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts. In this portion, he talks about how Friedan saw herself.
Friedan leaves the impression that her landmark book emerged principally from her suburban captivity. Her claim that she first became conscious of women's issues out of a disillusionment with middle-class life in American suburbs was part of her reinvention of herself as she wrote and promoted the feminine mystique. When I use the term here, reinvention, I refer to the process which all of us carry out to a greater or lesser extent of developing a series of narratives of our lives that are in turn shaped by how events, opportunity, and memory influence us. The success of Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, and it was enormously successful. The original print run was something like 6,000 copies, and it sold millions eventually. The success of the book was due in large measure to its claims that it spoke to and from the experiences of suburban housewives like herself. Betty Friedan was a suburban housewife in the 1950s, but she was, as you would expect, no ordinary suburban housewife. Friedan's feminism had its roots less in the suburban captivity of the 1950s, as she claimed, than in the labor union radicalism of the 1940s. That is a story that by and large hasn't been told until now, but one of which Friedan herself and American feminists, young and old, should be proud.
You can see Daniel Horowitz's entire speech at Smith College, Sunday at noon, 6 p.m., and midnight Eastern. You're watching Book TV, 48 hours of programs about books, authors, and the publishing industry. Every weekend, here on C-SPAN 2. A People's History of the United States is Howard Zinn's best-selling book. This cover says it sold more than 350,000 copies, but since this edition, sales have surpassed more than 500,000 copies. Next, Mr. Zinn discusses how he decided to become a historian and his goals in writing about America's past. He spoke last November at a Cambridge, Massachusetts restaurant.
Hello. Is this working? Yeah. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Hello, hello. At the end of the 20th century, we all talk about the need for community. That is, people coming together and getting close to each other, and that's what we're doing today. We're getting closer to each other. That's great. The Cambridge Center likes people to get to know each other and share their ideas across the table, and we've certainly done that today. Thank you for coming. I'm Jim Smith, the Executive Director of the Cambridge Center for Adult Education, the sponsor of this program, and thank you for coming. The center was founded 60 years ago on the idea that activist citizens like you and me who get actively involved in their education are essential for a healthy democracy. And as we talked with Jim and John, who own Fire and Ice, about doing this together, it's kicking off this series. We couldn't think of anyone better than Howard Zinn to keynote it and talk about this issue. I want to first introduce you to Jim Miller, one of the co-owners of Fire and Ice and our host today, and give him a hand for his nice hospitality.
Thank you very much for coming. I do want to say that we are in the midst of planning a regular speaker series, so we will be getting mailings out to everyone, and hopefully we'll have people as, not that there are many, but people that are as engaging and intriguing as Howard is. And I just want to say one word about Howard, and not so much about Howard, but about the people's history. It isn't simply a book about history. And that's why I think it has received the response it's received over many, many years of being reprinted and continues to be selling many, many years after it was written. It's a book about an approach to history, right? It's a book about how history really works and not the history that we were taught in high school works. It's about how history isn't some sort of flat objective reality, but history is the function of who's looking at it. That a war is very different from the perspective of a winning general than it is from the losing private, or even the winning private for that matter. So I think the book and the facts and the approach that Howard has put together is crucially important, not only as it represents certain facts, but as it represents a way of looking at history. So he may well have taken a whole other set of events and looked at them in that very same way, namely that the history is written by the winners, usually the male winners. And so that's why we're very pleased to kind of have to have Howard here today, because we think this really represents a new way, and not a new way, but such a sort of innovative way of looking at history. The notion of calling it revisionist history somehow assumes that it's revising something that's true. So I think that's a term I'd avoid. But anyway, do you want to, should I just?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, anyway, without further ado, I'd like to introduce a close friend, a wonderful man, and a great guy, Howard Zinn.
Howard's books, by the way, afterwards will be available up front.
Well, thanks for coming and eating, and happy to do something useful for the Cambridge Center for Adult Education, which has done a lot useful for this community for a long period of time. I've tried my best to help the Cambridge Center. I took introductory Italian 3 times, and it deserves a lot of support. So I'm here to talk about history and talk about it with you. So I'll try not to talk too long, give you a chance to say what you want to say, ask what you want to ask. I guess I...
We're sorry you're so tall.
Does this mic move up? Or do I have to lift the podium? Yeah. You want me to hold this? Oh, wait, oh. Should I hold it? No. Oh, okay. Is this okay for you? It's okay for you, but not for anybody else. We don't care about these other people. How about, can you all hear me back there? No. Somebody said no, somebody said yes.
Yes. Bring a couple books up down the back. Okay.
There we go.
We'll do it that way.
My book is so fat.
That's the, okay.
It solves the problem.
That's much better.
Yeah, that's what my book, in fact, is mostly used for. So,
Bring me one more.
is this all right?
Getting better. I have to get a signature on that in order for
Let's lift that book up.
presidential
Great.
Yeah. Is this okay?
That's better.
Yeah, can you hear me back there? Okay. I got into history. Began teaching history, studying history, writing history, not because I was simply interested in the past, not simply interested in sort of learning what happened. I say this because there's a lot of discussion about history which emphasizes sort of learning the facts about the past, and that's kind of history in which they you know, throw a lot of dates and facts at kids, and then they get very discouraged when they see kids don't know, you know, what came first, the Homestead Act or the Civil Service Act, or, you know, who was president in 1840, you know, that kind of history. And there's a lot of talk, even at the highest of circles, as if you consider the United States Senate a high circle. But there's a lot of talk at the highest of circles. I remember Dole. I don't know if you remember Dole, but I remember Dole, and I remember Dole talking in his presidential campaign to the American Legion, his favorite audience, and telling them, you know, kids have to learn facts. Well, I didn't get into history. I got into history because I was interested in the present, and I thought that history could be important in illuminating the present. I mean, to put it another way, I got into history with a very sort of modest objective. I wanted to change the world. And I thought that history might be useful for that purpose. By the time I began to study history, now I was a freshman at NYU at the age of 27. And so by the time I began studying history, I already had a number of experiences behind me which I suppose made me a little different than the 18-year-old kid who begins to study history in college. I had grown up in a working class family. I'd spent 3 years working in a shipyard. I enlisted in the Air Force and became a bombardier in the United States Air Force. I knocked around various jobs, and finally I was married. That's right, I should include that, shouldn't I? As a, you know, an experience. And married, and by the time I was a freshman at NYU, we had a daughter, and by the time I was a sophomore, we had a son. No, this did not continue through, you know, junior, senior, graduate school, you know, no. But the point is that by the time I began to study history, I already had these experiences which gave me a certain view about history. That is my upbringing, the family that I grew up in, the neighborhood that I grew up in, the working in a shipyard made me, you might say, class conscious. And a phrase that's not used too much in the United States. In Europe, they're sort of more accustomed to that. But yes, it made me class conscious, made me aware, you know, that we don't live in a society in which we're all one great happy family. And despite the fact that the Constitution begins, "We the people of the United States," and the Constitution was not made by we the people. It was made by a small number of quite rich white men. And didn't represent Native Americans or black people or women or working people. I was very conscious of the fact that we live in a class society of rich and poor and a lot of people in between, a lot of nervous people in between. So not knowing which way they were going to go. And so that when I began to study history, began to teach, began to write history, I was very aware of the fact that that what I was getting in the textbooks, what I was getting in my classes, did not seem to be aware of ordinary people, of working people. I was learning about the great economic miracle of the United States that occurred between the end of the Civil War and World War I, you know, when the United States became this great industrial power and the steel mills went up and all the coal was produced and the oil refineries and the transcontinental railroad and the heroes of Vanderbilt and Rockefeller and Carnegie and Harriman and Hill. I remember they were the heroes, and this was the great economic miracle. And but when I was studying that, as I say, class conscious as I was, and beginning to read on my own, because that's where my real education was taking place, reading on my own. That's what I think, where the real education takes place for most people, not sitting in class, but just going to the library and reading, you see. And so I was aware that there was something very seriously missing in those accounts of the economic miracle. What was missing was the people who worked in Carnegie steel mills and people who worked in Rockefeller's oil refineries and the laborers, the Chinese immigrants and the Irish immigrants who worked on the transcontinental railroad and died in large numbers in the heat and the cold, and or the girls who went to work in the textile mills of New England and, you know, at the age of 12 and died at the age of 25. So that view of history was a very different one. My experience in war made me very conscious of the fact that so much of our history was military history, and so much of our history was a glorification of military victories, and so many of our heroes were military heroes, just as, you know, the statues around the country are the statues of military heroes, you know. You don't find too many statues of anti-war protesters in city plazas around the country. In fact, I remember not long ago in Sherwin, there was some little pacifist group tried to set up a statue of Gandhi. Do you remember that? There's a great outcry. My God, a statue of Gandhi. It's not even in America. We have laws against immigrant statues, you know. Really. I was aware coming out of a war myself, having dropped bombs and coming to the conclusion that war really didn't solve any serious problem. It might seem to solve something in the short run, but it never really does in the long run, and in the meantime it kills enormous numbers of people indiscriminately. So I brought that consciousness to my teaching, my study of history, and my writing of history. And then my first teaching job was in Atlanta, Georgia, Black Women's College, Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia. And that gave me a new kind of orientation about history, because when you look at history from a point of view of African Americans, look at history from a point of view of black people, things look different. The heroes are different. The people who, Andrew Jackson had been a hero in traditional American history. I remember Arthur Schlesinger Jr. wrote this book in the 40s, The Age of Jackson, which Jackson was sort of, a forerunner of Franklin D. Roosevelt, a man of the people, a Democrat. From a point of view of black people, Jackson, the slave owner, Jackson, the racist. From the point of view of Native American people, Jackson, the killer of Indians. Different. Roosevelt looked different. Roosevelt, the progressive hero, the manly, very manly, loved war. That's what it means to be manly, apparently. And, but you look on any list of great presidents, lists drawn up by presumably sophisticated people, and somewhere always high up on the list is Theodore Roosevelt. Well, I was becoming very suspicious of traditional history and traditional heroes, and so it was no surprise to me when I looked deeper into Theodore Roosevelt, this great president who's, up there on Mount Rushmore. Hard to do something about that. I've tried, but it's hard to do something about Mount Rushmore, you see. And there is Theodore Roosevelt up there. And Theodore Roosevelt, who, when massacres took place in the Philippines, we waged a war. There's another thing, another little thing about our history. A lot of space to the Spanish-American War. Very little space, or no space, to the war in the Philippines, which followed the Spanish-American War. Spanish-American War, short, splendid war, as they said. War in the Philippines, long, bitter, bloody war. A war to conquer the Philippines. Not to free the Filipinos. No even pretense about that, as there was about Cuba. We're going to free Cuba from Spain. We didn't, of course. Yeah, the war in the Philippines, long, bitter, a kind of precursor of the Vietnam War. And it went on for years and years and years. And in 1906, there was a massacre by the American Army of Moros, the Filipinos who lived in one of the southern islands, who were Muslims. 600 of them. They lived a very primitive society. They had no modern weapons. Men, women, children. The American Army just wiped them out, every one of those 600 men, women, and children. And Theodore Roosevelt sent a letter of congratulations to the military commander for this splendid military victory, which prompted Mark Twain then to write a blistering letter to Theodore Roosevelt. Mark Twain was an anti-imperialist, and although I didn't learn about that in school, didn't learn a little. There were a lot of people who were mentioned in school in a nice way, but they didn't tell you about things that might have been embarrassing to the establishment, like Helen Keller. We always learned about Helen Keller, this noble person who accomplished so much with all these handicaps. They never told us Helen Keller was a socialist, that she was anti-war, that she walked on picket lines, that she even walked on a picket line when they were picketing a production of a play about her. Because the people were on strike and she wanted to support them. Yeah. Yeah, I came to study American history. You can see that I was not going to be an objective historian, you see. I didn't. I knew where I stood. I knew where I stood on issues of class, on issues of race, on issues of war and peace, and I was not going to be neutral. You know, some of you may know my memoir, although you'll never remember the title. You can't be neutral on a moving train. I say you'll never remember, because everybody gets the title wrong. People come up and say, I love your memoir. You can't be riding on a train you can't be training on neutral ground. You can't, but anyway, I always started my classes off right from the beginning telling them, this is not going to be a neutral class. You know, I'm not a neutral teacher. I have very strong convictions about the world. They don't have to be your convictions. And after all, you're not coming here as a blank slate. You've come here with many, many years of things that have been told to you, and you will leave here with other things that will be told to you, so I don't care if while you're with me, you are getting a very strong dose of what I believe in. Because no matter how strong I am about my convictions, I will never be able to make up with for this mountain of misinformation and lack of information that you've been getting all your life. And I said, you really, well, you can't be neutral. Yeah, you can't be neutral on a moving train because, and this is what I meant to say, I always have to explain what I mean to say, because obviously the first time I say it, it's not clear. Sometimes even my explanations are not clear for what I meant to say. But what I meant to say was that the world is already going in certain directions. The world is already moving. The things are happening, wars are taking place, kids are going hungry. And in a world like this, already moving in certain directions to be, quote, neutral, that's not to take a stand, you know, is to collaborate with whatever is happening. The word, I didn't want to be a collaborator with the way things were. And I always wanted to make a connection between past and present. You know, I thought that history was important, really important. That history was a matter of life and death. I don't want to put it too dramatically, because a lot of people, history is just a bunch of boring stuff. But no, I thought history was a matter of life and death, because if you don't know any history, you are a ready victim of whatever authority comes along and tells you something about the world. And you have no way of checking up on it, because you have no history. It's as if you were born yesterday. And so if the president gets up before the microphone and says, we've got to bomb the Sudan, well, more likely, he'll get up on the microphone and says, we've already bombed the Sudan. You see, it's a democratic way of consulting the public and everybody else. Or the president, well, if you have no history of presidential explanations for bombings, and he says, we're bombing the Sudan before, we're doing it for national security reasons, we're doing it because there's a nerve gas plant in the Sudan. Well, why? Yes, the president wouldn't lie to us. No. Well, if you had some history, you would know the president wouldn't lie to us. If you knew some history, you would know presidents lie all the time, have lied all the time. We have a long history of presidential lying, especially about things that go on overseas. It's very hard for the public to check up on what is happening in Sudan, just as it was very hard for the public in 1964 to check up on what was happening in the Gulf of Tonkin, when the president and the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense get up before the microphone and say, well, they've attacked us in the Gulf of Tonkin. And zoom, the Senate must pass a resolution giving the president full authority to do whatever he wants, you know, leading to a 10-year war in Southeast Asia and the deaths of several million people. If you knew some history when the president got up before the microphone and said things like that, you would say, wait, stop. Let's look into this. History, that's what history is for, to check up on what is going on. History can't give you definitive answers about what to do in the present and the future, but it can enlarge your view. It can cause you to look for more information. It can make you skeptical of things that you hear. So that, well, if both major parties together say we mustn't have big government, and in fact, if the president, well, this is what Clinton said in his last presidential campaign, he said, this is a quote, "The era of big government is over." Well, if you knew some history, you would know how absurd this statement was. You know, first of all, as if there were an era of big government, as if we hadn't had big government from the very, very beginning of this country. I mean, that's what the Constitution was about. The Constitution was set up to establish big government, to establish a strong government, a government that would do the work that slaveholders needed to be done, a government that would control things, that would control things like Shays' Rebellion out in western Massachusetts, a government that would protect people who were moving out west to take over Indian land, a government that would take care of the bondholders. There's a long, long, continuous line of governments taking care of bondholders from the Revolutionary period down to the present day. You know that that big government has existed in this country ever since the beginning of the Republic, that government was big in handing out enormous free grants of land to the railroads, and tariffs to subsidize the manufacturers, in using the power of the government to protect employers against labor strikes, to put people like Eugene Debs in jail, to send the army out to take care of workers who are out on... I mean, the government has always been big in defense of the business interests, the corporate interests of the country. And it was only in the 20th century when, for the first time, the government began, under the impact of social movements, on the impact in the early 20th century of the Socialist Party and the IWW, and then in the 60s, under the impact of the movements of the 60s, when the government, pressured by these movements, began to pass reform laws. And in the 30s and the 60s, Social Security and unemployment insurance and subsidized housing, and then in the 60s, Medicare. Then, when for the first time the government began doing things to ordinary people, the people greatly needed, then the cry went up, big government. And a cry not only from the Republican Party, but a cry now from the Democratic Party, which is shameful. So you'd have to know some history in order to be able to really think about what is being said to us by the people in power, and then to go out and look for yourself for sources of information that will widen your understanding and perhaps enable you to then join together with other citizens, because if you don't join together with other citizens to do something about what's going on in the world, you can't certainly depend on the people who are in power to take care of the injustices that exist or to make sure that we don't get into another war. Now, looking at my watch to show you that I really care. Well, so I began to write and to teach from the standpoint of people whose point of view had been, I thought, ignored, black people and women and Native Americans, protesters and dissidents, you know, And yes, and things looked different. History looked different when you look at it not from the top, but from down below, where most of the people are, and where most of the problems are. And of course, I have a lot more to say, but I think I should stop and give you a chance, and then sneak in what else I was going to say, you know, in pretending to answer your questions. So, yes.
The president is about to bomb Iraq again.
Hmm.
Would you like to make some comments?
The president is about to bomb Iraq again. Well, the word again is important, right? Because then it suggests that we bombed Iraq before. And if you were very small and young at that time, or if your memory has lapsed, which happens a lot, you know, that you might forget that we bombed Iraq before. And you might forget how much we accomplished by bombing Iraq before. And but there again, you know, knowing some history. For one thing, we'd be bombing Iraq because there's a tyrant in power who is assembling dangerous weapons, right? I mean, that's... But knowing a little history, you might think back and ask yourself, are we really, this government, seriously concerned about Iraq because a tyrant is in power? You mean we have always been seriously concerned about tyrants in power? In fact, what is the record of the United States with regard to tyrants in power all over the world? And the record of the United States is very clear. The record is that we have supported tyrants in power. In fact, we supported Saddam Hussein before he became our enemy. But we supported tyrants in power all over the world, in Latin America, in the Philippines, in the Middle East, everywhere. You know, and so to know that history is to begin to suspect hypocrisy, you know, or to, you know, to say we're very concerned with weapons of mass destruction. Well, we concerned with weapons of mass destruction? We, the country with the greatest supply of weapons of mass destruction in the world? And after all, we have used our weapons of mass destruction in very terrible ways. I mean, I'm not just talking about the use of nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I'm talking about how we used our weapons of mass destruction and chemical weapons, and all these weapons with which we're frightening people. As people deserve to be frightened by these weapons, but they deserve to be frightened by these weapons whether they're in the possession of Iraq or of Turkey or of Syria or of Indonesia or of the United States, of all these countries in the world. And so you get suspicious, and then you look into the history a little more, and you find that what seems to be central in the concern of the United States in the Middle East is not the existence of tyrants. I mean, we haven't been supporting democracies in the other Arab countries in the world, but what seems to be central is oil. And you go back to World War II, and you go back to the fact that during World War II, the United States eases the British petroleum companies out of the Middle East and moves the American companies into the Middle East. And from that point on, oil becomes our main concern. And that's the nationalization of oil in Iran leads us to overthrow the government of Iran in 1953. And so there's a continuous line of actions in the Middle East based on our oil. And it's not even based on the question of whether we have oil, because we're not going to be deprived of oil, because whoever has the oil has to sell the oil. See, we're not going to be deprived of oil. The question is, how much are we going to have to pay for the oil? And the United States has gone to war over the price of oil. There actually was one article, one day in the New York Times. You have to read the New York Times very carefully, and not skip a day, because you might skip the one day in which somebody told you something important and truthful. And it was one article in the New York Times on the eve of this last bombing of Iraq, the last war against Iraq, in which the writer said, you know, this war, if we go to war, it's going to be over the price of oil. Yeah, we need a lot of education to be done about the United States, the Middle East, foreign policy, dictatorships and tyrants. I mean, there's no question about Saddam Hussein being evil and so on. It's just that you have to question whether really this, the deposing of evil, is the motive of a policy which, in the pretending to be most concerned about evil, kills huge numbers of people. Like we've already killed large numbers of people in Iraq. We did not kill Saddam Hussein. We killed ordinary Iraqi citizens. You have to remember that. When you go to war, whatever you do, you kill ordinary people. You bomb the other country, you kill ordinary people. You kill victims. You don't kill perpetrators. Any other trivial questions? Yes. Yes.
I recently went to a conference at Plymouth Plantation on the Wampanoag Indians with both Indians and non-Indians scholars, and I'm interested in your interpretation of the celebration of Columbus Day and Thanksgiving.
We could go through all the holidays. We're about to, tomorrow is Veterans Day. It used to be Armistice Day. Columbus Day, Thanksgiving. Well, for Thanksgiving, I don't know what to say about Thanksgiving, but it's you know, the pretense of, there are even Thanksgiving stories written for kids in which they say, we invited the Indians, we, you know, our fathers, certainly, you know, one of my ancestors, I know, invited the Indians to a feast, which the Indians were not accustomed to, you see. And this was an actual history book for kids, and gave them things they'd never heard of, you know, like corn, you know, potatoes, you know. Well, yeah, Thanksgiving, you know, the whole business of Thanksgiving, and which hides the, you know, the simple fact that we came over here. Granted, you know, those people, you know, had various reasons for leaving, but the fact is they took over the land that these people lived on, and when these people resisted, they massacred them, bringing massacres in return. I don't want to, you know, deny massacres took place on both sides, but underlying the massacres on both sides was the fact that they were living on this land with their own kind of civilization, and our ancestors drove them out and annihilated them when they resisted. Now, let's talk about what's missing in the history books. The only thing I learned about our Indian history when I went to school was, yeah, the Pilgrims and Thanksgiving and John Smith and Pocahontas and Custer's Last Stand. You know, the few things, that's it. I did not learn you know, and I went all the way up, if you can consider that all the way up, to a PhD in history. And but I really didn't learn about the fact that we had waged countless wars against the Indians in the course of taking over this country. The maps on our schoolrooms, high school schoolrooms, were westward expansion. It was expansion. It was like a biological thing. You just expanded. They didn't tell you what was the cost, the human cost of this expansion. It was a Louisiana Purchase. Everything was neat. It was just a nice bargain, commercial transaction. It was $15 million for this enormous territory, doubling the size of the country. And it's vacant. You can tell because you look at the map. And it's huge. It says Louisiana Purchase, and it's vacant. But very, very large numbers of Indians lived in this territory, and in order for that territory to become part of the United States, they had to be annihilated. Anyway, I'm sorry to talk about Thanksgiving drove me to this, but Columbus The Columbus story, well, really, we always refer people to our books, right? Sure, you know, we don't want to give it all away. Well, actually, you don't even have to buy my book. You just have to, like, pick it up, browse in it, read the first 10 pages, and it'll tell you things about Columbus that... The nice part of it, there's a nice part of the story, and that is that the telling of the Columbus story has changed over the past, I don't know, 10, 15 years. That for the first time, that original glory story of Columbus, the adventurer, Columbus, the brave man, Columbus, the great navigator, Columbus, the religious man, that totally heroic story of Columbus, that has given way, not totally, of course, but at least partially. In thousands of classrooms around the country now, the story of Columbus is taught in a different way. In fact, I just got in the mail a copy of there's an outfit in Milwaukee called Rethinking Schools, a wonderful outfit who they have contacts with teachers all over the country, and a great resource for teachers who want to know where to get good books for kids and so on. And they've just put out a revised edition of what in the quincentennial year, 1992, was for them a bestseller, a 100-page sort of booklet on Columbus called Rethinking Columbus, which immediately sold 200,000 copies. And now they put in a new edition with rich material. So, you know, there's hope for a revision of the Columbus story. Yes. Yes.
Speaking of revision, you know, there was all that hubbub about Jefferson and Sally Hemings, and one of the things that I heard on NPR was that, you know, certainly there have been academics, and in fact, African-American and female academics who have talked about the Sally Hemings relationship with Jefferson and the fact that they'd had a child, at least one, together before, but that people didn't seem to take that quite as seriously. I'm wondering, from your perspective as a white male who's in the academic world, are there things that you've done to change that kind of, because academia is certainly one of the last bastions probably of white male power structure.
Academia as a bastion of white male power?
Hard to believe.
Really? By the way, I am not in academia anymore. I happily left some years ago. I no longer teach. But you're asking what I have done? I mean, what I have?
What's your view on it, and what have you done?
Well, I haven't done anything specifically on that particular...
Right, not that particular
no, not
issue,
particular. But, I mean, the main point is that slavery was not just a sort of embarrassing blip in American history. And very often, you know, it's passed over that way. It's sort of very interesting. Here we have, well, you know how we're inundated with self-congratulation about our country and our democracy and et cetera, et cetera. And when you think that we had slavery for over 200 years, we had held black slaves in this country for over 200 years, that you can't simply talk about our history as if it's been a glorious democratic country but there was this little problem of slavery, which we took care of. You say, of course, we never did take care of it. We still haven't really taken care of the legacy of slavery. But I think the story of Jefferson Sally Hemings is very important simply because it sort of makes people think about not just slavery as an abstraction, but slavery as a reality for black people, especially for black women, for slave women. And that whole issue of how slavery, bad enough in itself, was doubly bad or triply bad for slave women in what they had to endure. And that this endurance took place at the hands of one of the founding fathers doesn't only sort of emphasize the fact that this was part of the national heritage, And I think, and those of us who have tried to write about slavery in a fuller way and bring it down to human terms and make people understand what slaves went through, was very almost impossible thing to do. But one of the ways in which to do that is I think, to bring forth the personal stories of what, especially what slave women endured. And the Jefferson Sally Hemings story is a sort of a way of emphasizing that. Yeah.
Actually, one of my questions was about the legitimacy of the speaker. That because you are a white man, perhaps, not you necessarily, but a lot of white male academics, that their voice is going to get heard. And so if you're going to expose the issue of the intermarriage or the rape of slave women, that somehow that gets a little bit more legitimacy than if it's an African-American woman. Oh, she's got that same thing she's always harping on. I'm wondering if you have a thought about that.
Well, I do have a thought about it, yeah. If I didn't have a thought about it, you've given me a thought about it, you see. But, yeah, it's sad, you see, that people will take, you know, the message better from somebody that they identify with, that rather than from the oppressed group itself, you know. But you know, and this has been true for a long time. But I think, and here again, every once in a while, I come up with an encouraging bit of information, just, you know, to lessen the number of suicides of people who walk out of the room that I'm in. And the encouraging thing is that we now have a whole new generation of African-American historians, of now men, women. We, in fact, have a whole new generation of Native American historians who, and Native American studies departments. And so that more and more it is possible, whereas at one time, yes, a lot of this came from white academics because there weren't that many black academics around, you know. But more and more we're getting to hear the story from people, African-American men, women. But I think we all, you know, we all have a responsibility in our own way to do what we can. Yes.
You had stated that you were sort of anti-war, and I was wondering what you thought of the oppressed rising up against their oppressors, and more specifically what you think of like the FSLN and the guerrillas up in Guatemala.
Well, that's one of the toughest questions. I hate tough questions. No, it's an important question. It's very hard. I am anti-war because I believe that war, you know, by definition, is the indiscriminate killing of large numbers of people for even if a social purpose is proclaimed, the social purpose is distant and the killing is immediate. And so that even in a revolutionary situation, as sympathetic as you are to the revolutionists, you have to face the fact that revolutions, when they become murderous, you know, lose a focus. They begin to get indiscriminate. And in fact, this happened in El Salvador, where a lot of even the you know, the guerrilla revolutionary movement in El Salvador began doing things to ordinary peasants, you know, and things get and so ugly things are done for an end which either is then not achieved, or if it is achieved, begins to turn sour. And one of the reasons it begins to turn sour, I think, is because the revolutions have been corrupted in the process by what becomes an addiction to violence. And so I think that the great intellectual challenge of our time, the great political challenge, the great human challenge of our time, is how to achieve social justice, how to bring about, yes, revolutionary change without massive violence. And I think of South Africa, and I think of the fact that the African National Congress could have decided on armed struggle in a large-scale way, that is a bloody civil war to end apartheid in South Africa, and probably would have won, and apartheid would have been ended. Maybe 1 million people would have been killed, most of them black probably, but apartheid would have been ended. And I think the African National Congress at a certain point made a decision that that kind of armed revolutionary struggle on that scale would not be a good thing for the black people of South Africa, that instead they would certainly not submit, certainly not be passive, but they would engage in a different kind of warfare that is a kind of guerrilla warfare, perhaps kind of a wearing down of the enemy, a use of many different tactics, of strikes, of boycotts, some acts of violence, yes. Bringing of international pressure, economic pressure, sanctions. Now that takes longer to solve a problem than war. See, the thing that's seductive about war is it's a quick solution. But it's a quick solution which doesn't solve basic problems. And a protracted struggle against injustice without massive violence requires a longer period of time, requires a lot of risk and sacrifice and pain and suffering in the meantime, in a way that the people of South Africa have suffered in all these years that they, under apartheid, but they did it. I mean, not that they've solved all their problems, obviously, and not that huge problems still remain, but apartheid as that institution is gone, and without that massive civil war. And so, you know, I think those people who welcomed, you know, revolutions, revolutionary movements, guerrilla movements in various parts of the world where ugly dictatorships were in power, need to rethink that question of tactics. Because, well, you'll see in El Salvador, after all these years, they finally had to come to a political solution, which is not really a solution, which may just postpone, you know, postpone the day of justice in El Salvador, but a lot of people were being killed and they weren't getting anywhere. So, yeah, that's an important question, yes.
Howard, I think we're going to take just one more question, and then we got to let you sign books from those people.
Okay.
What do you think would have prevented in political action the Second World War?
What would have prevented?
The Second World War.
What would have prevented the Second World War? I thought I had tough questions up to now.
In 1 minute, Howard.
One. It's, leaving aside what might have been done early on against Hitler, but I would say a war in which 50 million people are killed, and at the end of it you get rid of a few specific manifestations of fascism, but leave a world of fascisms and militarism and imperialism still intact all over the world, and leaving two superpowers with enormous weapons of mass destruction is not something to be cherished as the right way to get rid of fascism. What would have taken? Resistance, guerrilla warfare, focused acts. I mean, there was resistance in Norway, there was resistance in Denmark, there were during World War II, there were specific acts of resistance in certain places. There's a kind of resistance which even the most powerful military machine cannot deal with. If they can deal with massive military maneuvers, but they can't easily deal with strikes, with boycotts, with the resistance of an entire population. It takes longer time. I mean, it's very hard to go back over World War II. Always have to go back over a past event. A past event has the look of being inevitable once it's happened. And so the way fascism was ended in Europe has the look of inevitability, as if there were no other possible way to deal with fascism. And we would need to use an enormous amount of imagination to try to figure out how it could have been done without 50 million lives being lost and without leaving a world as it was left after World War II. Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We'd like to get Howard up to here where he'll sign some books, hopefully, and say hello to you and maybe answer a few questions as he's doing that. So if we can let Howard out and then say hello to him on the way out. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Will you bring it up to the, why don't you bring it up to the table so you get there and she'll pick it up there. Why don't you go right up there?
48 hours of nonfiction books on TV. You're watching Book TV on C-SPAN 2. Coming up, Cincinnati, Ohio journalist Laura Pulfer discusses her new book, I Beg to Differ, a collection of her newspaper columns and radio commentaries. She's followed by sociologist Sarah Diamond, who's published her fourth book examining the accomplishments and influence of conservative Christian organizations. Then Detroit Free Press columnist Leslie Hazelton talks about her book about driving across country to the Detroit Auto Show. Book TV is returning to the road with the C-SPAN school bus. Each month we'll visit bookstores, stop by book festivals, and take you to book conferences across the country. And this month we stop in Austin, Texas. We'll be live from Book People, an independent bookstore in Austin. On Saturday, we'll talk with the store's owners to learn about Texas writers and the book industry in that state. And on Sunday, you'll see a conversation with Mary Beth Rogers, who wrote a biography of Barbara Jordan, the first black senator from Texas since the Reconstruction era. Book TV, live from Austin, Texas, January 23rd and 24th. Tonight, History on Book TV features author Jonathan Spence. He talks about his book, The Chan's Great Continent, China in Western Minds. Here's a portion of his speech.
This book, as I said, trying to cover 700 years from the 1250s and 60s down to pretty much our own time, at least the 1980s. The book is cautious, I think, about the idea of Orientalism. We've been told by many theorists,
then you're willing to let it sit there for a while. We don't advertise at all. It's been one of the things from the very beginning. We just have the smallest box available in the yellow pages, and if we could really find a way to justify getting rid of that we would. We've always just put all of our money into our books, and we've figured that's been our selling point, and word of mouth, which we've always figured word of mouth is the best advertising you can get. Probably the most impressive thing is the fact that there's two of us. My father fills in from time to time, but it's a 5,000 square foot store that's totally stocked, cashiered, and everything else by my partner and I, with my father filling in at odd times when we need to get out. Although I believe this year we'll finally hire our first employee. One of the things we've tried to do in here is to not have it the image of the stereotypical used bookstores with dust and beat up volumes on the shelves. We've tried to keep everything well lighted. We don't try to keep books on the floor. We hope maybe to get it to be a bridge between the new bookstore market and the used bookstore market. a lot of people I know come in here that used to never shop at used bookstores, but when they see it nicely well lit and clean, they can see it as an alternative to new and not feel that they're going into a store that's dark and dusty and all that. And I think that's helped our business quite a bit.
You're watching Book TV. 48 hours of programs covering books, authors, and the publishing industry. Write us with your comments or suggestions at 400 North Capitol Street, Northwest, Suite 650, Washington, D.C. 20001, or call us at area code 202-626-4898. Cincinnati-based journalist Laura Polfer has collected her columns and public radio commentaries into this book. I beg to differ. Politically incorrect, proudly Midwestern, potentially funny. That's her picture on the cover of this book. Over the next 40 minutes, she talks about her book and the views found inside to an audience in her hometown.
Thank you. Okay, now you have to tell me if you can't hear. You can signify by looking bored. Would that when I first came to Cincinnati, I hadn't been here too long, and I listened to, hi, how are you? I keep seeing so many faces I know. I was listening to the radio, and I heard Bob Trumpy on the radio, and he was talking about the very first touchdown he ever made for the Cincinnati Bengals. And he said that he ran into the end zone and he high-fived everybody, and he was turning somersaults, and he was so excited. And the late Paul Brown came over to him, put his arm around his shoulder, and said, "Son, try and act like you've been there before." And I keep trying to act like I've been there before, but I've never written a book before, and I'm telling you, I could not be more excited than I am about this book. And there were a lot of things that I didn't know about writing a book. Like, for instance, I thought once you wrote it and you got some somebody to agree to publish it, that you could call it anything you wanted. And I wanted to call my book, Should Miss America Wear a Muumuu? And they wouldn't let me. They wanted to call it, I begged to differ, and they said, you know, I pictured an artist doing some wonderful, alluring picture on the cover that would look so attractive that everybody would want to buy it, but instead, they told me that they wanted to have my picture on the cover, and they asked me who I would like to have take my picture. And I said Corson Hirschfeld. And I don't know if you know Corson Hirschfeld, but he took this picture, and he's absolutely wonderful. And I had heard that he could make me look thin. But I'd forgotten that Corson did a lot of work for National Geographic, and so he insisted on having this little monkey in the picture. And she was supposed to be down here, down by my feet, but she was afraid that she was out of the frame, and so she climbed up in my lap, and she was a biter. So I said, leave her where she is. Don't try and move her. So after the picture was taken, then I thought we should call the book Buy This Book or The Monkey Gets It. And they wouldn't let me do that either. So as my tiny little act of revenge, whenever I get a chance to read something from my book, I always read Should Miss America Wear a Muumuu? Did you watch the Miss America pageant this year? In case you missed it, Leonard Horn would like you to know that he made every attempt to make the pageant more relevant. Mr. Horn is president of the event, now in its 77th year, and for the first time, contestants were allowed to compete in either a two-piece or a one-piece bathing suit. The choice was left to each woman. Now, lest these young women become giddy with this new freedom, the pageant officials were careful to specify standards. Regulations include a full or modest rear with the bottoms no more than 1.5 inches below the navel. women also were allowed to wear summer sandals. Are these guys risk takers or what? We want to encourage them to look their age, Leonard says. And in fact, most women know that we are encouraged to look their age, that is 17 to 24, for the rest of our natural lives. So this is probably also relevant. Leonard told a reporter that he cringes at the contest being called a beauty pageant. He says he prefers to call it a scholarship program. There is, of course, only one relevant response to this. Ha 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 ha. Ha. Some pageant officials have suggested that the bathing suit portion of the competition merely has to do with fitness and good health. Ability to withstand a grueling public schedule. In that case, I guess that in addition to looking at his role in democratic fundraising, we are really going to have to demand that we see Al Gore in a Speedo. Oh. I'll just give you a couple of seconds to rid yourself of that mental image. Huh. And what of the message this sends to the nation's youth? I don't mean young girls. They're already used to the idea that they need to starve themselves into acceptability when they're young. Later, of course, they'll be expected to carve away wrinkles and hoist their breasts. But what about the young men of this country? Every year they can see a fully sanctioned prime time rating of women's bodies. Then we send them out into the workplace where they may be fired for noticing that Ms. Dilbert in the next cubicle has nice legs. No wonder they're confused. It wasn't until the 1940s that they added the scholarship money, and Lee Merriweather was the first Miss America crowned on television. I'm not sure when they started quizzing the finalists, giving them the opportunity to tell us that their dearest wish is for world peace and the opportunity to star in a major motion picture. But this year, for the first time, quote, without censorship or the involvement of the Miss America organization, according to Leonard. These girls were quizzed by a professional journalist, Nancy Glass of American Journal, formerly a reporter for PM Magazine, Sneak Preview, and Inside Edition, was chosen to, quote, ask the tough questions. I guess Maureen Dowd and Susan Faludi were unavailable. Anyway, the young contestants are talented and they do have brains. Answering the tough questions, they seem like very nice people. But they have to parade down a ramp dressed in almost nothing. The Miss America pageant is a full-body beauty contest, and as long as young women have to take off their clothes to qualify as winners, it's silly to pretend that it's anything better. Thank you. After that column ran, I got a lot of positive response, but I also got a lot of response from people who thought that I was not being nice to the girls who competed in the contest. And frankly, I think that there are probably a lot of young girls that's the way they got to go to college. I just don't think that that's the way they should have to get to go to college. I think that we could figure out if somebody is attractive without making them strip down to their underwear, which is essentially what they have to do. I get lots of response to my column, particularly if it's a topic that people have lots of different opinions on. And there's a fellow named Marty who has been calling me almost from the first day that I started at the Enquirer, and he hates everything about me. He even hates my nasal voice, as he puts it. I always think, geez, Marty, what do you want me to do? Have my adenoids out just for you? But he's been calling me since I started at the Enquirer, and I've written about him a few times, and people are always asking me if I have made Marty up, and I always say, well, no. If I were going to invent somebody, I would make someone up who thinks that I'm witty and brilliant. I wouldn't make up somebody who hates me. And the fact is that we really, not only are we not allowed to make things up, but you don't really need to make things up, especially things that are funny, because the world is already so funny that I can't imagine that you could think of something that would be funnier than some of the things that already happen. And when I think of that, I think of a column that I did that was one of those columns that when I was kind of explaining to my editor what the column was going to be about, she just couldn't imagine that I would make these things, that these things had anything to do with each other, but I think they do. You see what you think. This column is called "The Brain is a Terrible Thing to Waste." Every time they come up with something new that isn't good for you, it's something that I especially like. Don't smoke. Don't eat cheese. Don't eat eggs unless you cook them at 940 degrees for 4 days. Don't sit in the sun. Don't sit on the couch. In fact, don't sit down at all except to floss your teeth. Don't have wild, erotic, promiscuous sex unless vicariously on daytime television. Don't. This is why I was so enthusiastic about a new report warning people not to eat squirrel brains. This is a diet hardship I feel prepared to endure. In addition to squirrel brains, doctors have issued a warning that we should all curb our lust for the brains of elk, deer, mink, and rodents of all kinds. I am thinking of giving them up for Lent. Squirrels, according to a study by the neurology department at the University of Kentucky in Lexington, might carry a variant of mad cow disease. In the last 4 years, 11 people in rural Kentucky have contracted this rare disease. All of them were squirrel brain eaters, one of the doctors said. Well, I don't have to be hit over the head with a brick. Beginning right this minute, I am swearing off squirrel brains for good. If I find myself about to fall off the squirrel brain wagon, I will distract myself with chocolate mint chip ice cream or nacho cheese Doritos, which have so far not been part of any official warning. The next time I'm wondering whether I should climb on the treadmill for an hour, I'll notice that I haven't been eating any squirrel brains. While I'm filled with self-loathing after a popcorn hogorama, I'll remind myself that somewhere in Kentucky, people who have no regard for their health are gorging on you-know-what. You'd think learning that you're not supposed to do something you didn't want to do in the first place would be about all the good news a person could get in 1 week. But, as it happens, my personal cup runneth over. After years of filling out Reader's Digest sweepstake forms and licking Publishers Clearinghouse stamps, I received notice of a prize I would be delighted not to win. First of all, you have to go to an exhibit of the art of Yoko Ono. To give you an idea of what that might be like, you should know that part of it is an interactive work cleaning piece which instructs visitors to move river stones from one pile to another, as if you hadn't done enough work that day. Assigning emotions to the rocks such as sorrow and happiness. Also on display is something called telephone piece, which includes an actual telephone promising the occasional call from the artist herself. She didn't say when or how often she'd call, and one exhibitor said, "You just have to be lucky enough to be standing next to the exhibit when the phone rings." I didn't know how to break it to her, but most people's idea of luck is Ed McMahon showing up on Super Bowl Sunday with a check for $1 million. And I'd rather move around a big rock representing sorrow than chat with Yoko Ono. What would I say? Hi, Yoko, how's it going? Say, I don't mean to be rude, but why did you ruin the Beatles? And also, why were you always taking off your clothes? Then, no doubt, somebody would wrest the phone from me and hand me a big rock that represents being an embarrassment to my hometown, my country, and possibly the planet. I hope they'd give me one more chance to say something important and meaningful. Yoko. Peace, love, and don't eat any squirrel brains. People have asked me why I decided to do a book, and of course it was for the money. But now I've discovered that you don't make a lot of money, so it's for the fun. And I'm really, really, really having a good time. But the true reason why I wanted to do a book, and I don't know why this always seems so important to me. I'm so nuts about my mother, and I always, from the time I was a little kid, thought I would love to grow up and put a book in her hands with my name on it that would go in a library, that would have my name on the spine. And when I was talking with Orange Fraser Press, the people who were good enough to publish my book, I kept saying I wanted it to be a hardback book because that's what I wanted for my mother. Now, I have to say that if I'd known that it was going to be so successful and that I would be taking the book so many places myself, I would have written a lighter book. But I would like to read this to you, and I hope that this will mean something to you. That it's, I write a lot of personal things, and when I write personal things, it's not because I think I'm unique. It's not because I think I'm special. It's because I think something has happened to me, or something that I think feels like something that's happened to you. So I hope I'm right sometimes. This is called A Round of Applause for the Bleachers. Thanks to my mother, I will never be famous. While Joan Crawford was beating her daughter with wire clothes hangers, my mommy dearest was signing up to be a Girl Scout brownie leader. Therefore, Christina Crawford had the opportunity to be a best-selling author and talk show guest. I learned how to tie a square knot and sing Do Your Ears Hang Low in 3-part round. So far, this has not qualified me to be a guest on Oprah. Mom never abused me, although she did make me go to school on the queen mother of all bad hair days, right after a Tony Home permanent. And she had some terrible, awful, old